Morning, Gordon. This morning we're going to show how to replace the front crankshaft seal on a 300D turbo engine or a 300D engine, either one. Actually a 240 would be essentially the same way. What happens is the engines outlast the seals, and so this is the front crankshaft seal that we're going to replace, and the crankshaft goes in this centerpiece right here, and then this seal's on the outside. It's this seal in the middle that eventually goes bad, and the crankshaft starts to leak oil around the front, and you'll just get oil coming from all around the front of the engine. And it's not hard to replace, it's getting to it that's the problem. You got to pull several things off, and perhaps you even want to write these down. As I recall, what we have to do is take the air cleaner off because it's in our way, and then we need to pull the radiator out because it's in our way. After we pull the radiator, we need to pull the belts off. All three belts have to come off. Then we need to pull the fan blade. It's got 4 bolts. The fan blade has to come off. Then we have to pull the pulley that runs all of that mechanism. And then we have to pull what's called a balancing disc or the harmonic balancer. And finally we get to the seal. So we have to do several things. Now let's go through some of the tools that we're going to need. I've just got a set of open-end wrenches, open box-end combination wrenches here. Anywhere from 10 millimeter up to about 19 millimeter. I'm going to need various sizes, mostly to pull the belts off. In addition to that, I've got just a standard 3/8 drive set, a speed handle, some ratchets, a small set of sockets. So those are just tools also that I'll use in getting the various belts loose. Now, and I need a screwdriver. I don't have a small one. I'll need one, I know, for those hose clamps on that radiator. But here's a special tool that you'll need. In order to take the fan bolt, the 4 fan bolts off, the bolts that hold the fan blade, you would think that you might be able to use what's called a flare wrench. The problem is they're 10 millimeters and they're real tight, and you'll round them off if you're not careful. So the temptation is to use a flare wrench. The problem is it won't work. It's too thick that way, a standard flare wrench. So what most mechanics I know do is they take and grind off a 10 millimeter box end. Now if you look very closely with that camera, you can see that I've taken a grinder and I've ground off the edge. That's how tight that bolt is in there. So I've had to grind off an edge, and everyone I know that works on these has one of the wrenches that they've done that to, that they use for just that purpose. So once we get that off of there, then the next step really, after we get the belts off, is to take the pulley off. And what you have to have is a set of Allen wrenches, and I forgot what size. It's probably like about I suspect it's a 6 or a 7 millimeter. I just have a whole set of them, but I'll tell you when I get to it which one it is, but I think it's 6, 7, 8 millimeter, somewhere in that range. There's 6 of them, and they hold the pulley on there. That'll take the pulley off. And then finally, when we get to the big crankshaft bolt, it's a 27 millimeter on the front of the crankshaft that holds that pulley on there. Actually, I mean, it holds the balancing disc on there. And that's the only place on this car where I need to use a 3/4 inch drive set. This is a 27 millimeter socket. Actually, the inch equivalent of it is the same size as a 1 1/16 inch. So if your local hardware store has a 1 1/16 inch socket, that'll work too, or 27 millimeter. But notice this is 3/8 drive, and that bolt is on there tight. So in order not to hurt my back, I always use a big cheater pipe. So what I'm going to do is put a cheater pipe on this thing, and that way I won't have any strain. But it's literally going to take some force to get that off of there. Now, in order to mark that thing, because it can go on backwards 180 degrees out, that balancing disc, I always have a little paint. I always put a paint mark on there. Just a little. I use just automotive touch-up paint. It's got a little brush on it. Actually, I need to get the brush out of there. But at any rate, we'll get the brush out, and that's just a touch-up paint, white, so it's real clearly visible. Then I got a set of 1/2-inch drive sockets, and then finally, when I get to the little horseshoe that holds this thing on, I need a 5mm Allen. But these hex or Allen wrenches right here, my experience is it's a real tight spot for 2 of those, and a regular ratchet with one of these long 5mm Allen wrenches is just in a little bit of a tight spot. So you have to have either one of 2 things. You need a standard 5mm Allen like that, because the shank is real short on that side. You can get into that tight spot. I happen to have a 5mm that's real short in a 1/4-inch drive, and I find that real convenient. But you're going to have a hard time finding one of those. Craftsman doesn't make one. That one is Proto, I believe. No, it's Snap-on. And that one I had to chase a Snap-on guy down to get that little 5mm in a 1/4-inch drive. One of the other problems, or can be problems, is this seal also has a disc like that that's in front of it, toward the front of the car, and sometimes that can be real tough to get off. Sometimes it's stuck on there, and about the only way to get it off, I have 3 possible methods. One is to cut it with a Dremel tool. Here's an old one that I cut once upon a time. I was frustrated, couldn't get it off. I didn't have a torch where I was. I didn't have a special kind of puller. And you can see that I've cut it to where it's real, it got real weak, and I could pull it off of there. And you got to be careful not to nick the crankshaft, although it's not real consequential if you do, because it's not in a place where it needs to be real smooth. But at any rate, I cut this one off like that. Another way to do that, if you have just a propane torch, is to heat this up, and then it should slide off. If you heat this up, this will get hot and expand before the crankshaft will. Another special tool that we need is a harmonic balance puller. We've got to pull that balancing disc off of the crankshaft, and this is a standard puller that you can buy at any auto parts store. It's got a whole assortment of both metric and SAE bolts that are used, and they screw into special holes on the typical harmonic balancers, and that's the way we pull that off, so to show you how to use that. And then the last thing we've got here, I believe, is just a drain to drain out the coolant before we take the radiator out. So let's go take a look at this. Okay, now the first thing we're going to do, as we said, is pull the radiator. And we covered that in another video. The way we pull these radiators is we separate the oil cooler from the radiator. There are 2 10mm bolts that hold some clamps on top and bottom. You can see my fingers pointing one right here. So it's real easy. We just take a socket and loosen that and disconnect this oil cooler. We leave the oil cooler connected for this whole operation. Then we've got the upper and lower radiator hoses to disconnect, and of course first we drain the radiator. So we disconnect the upper and lower radiator hoses. There's a overflow hose here that we disconnect. We take this fan shroud off. Underneath on the bottom there are 2 radiator lines. I think they're 19mm open end that you have to use, and there's a couple of hoses, radiator hoses on the bottom, a fill hose and then a bottom radiator hose. So you got to take all those hoses off, and then these 2 clamps are the last thing. They pop out with a screwdriver, and we just lift that whole radiator out. So we want to take the radiator off. We're also going to take this breather off because it's kind of in the way of loosening up, and there's no reason to have it. It just takes a few minutes to get off, and there's no reason to have it on there. It's in the way of loosening up that alternator belt. So that's what we're going to do, and we'll come back when we get all that off of there. Okay, we've got the radiator out, we took the air breather off, and now we're ready to pull that fan. There are 4 bolts that hold that fan on there, and they are here. That one and that one. Don't pull the ones toward the front of the engine that are on the back of the fan. They hold that viscous coupler on there. We don't want to pull those off. This is a special wrench that we need that's ground down, and use a box end that's ground down. If you use an open end wrench on those bolts like that, I guarantee you'll round off the corners. You don't want to do that. Now also, we're going to have to keep changing the position to get to the lower bolts. So I've set up a 1/2 inch drive with just a standard 27mm socket that'll go on that front crankshaft bolt. And so if I put it on there, what I want to do is always turn that engine in its natural direction of rotation. Don't turn it backwards. And what it wants to go is this way. You can always tell by looking at the fan. So as you look at the front of the engine is supposed to turn clockwise. So if you look, what we want to do is put this, and it'll just fit. And the belts on the alternator are going to hold that tight. And you can see how tight those are. And it's going to take you a little while. You're going to have some patience to get those out because they're in a real nasty tight spot. But what we're going to do is rotate that engine a little bit and then pull those 6 out. And you have to have the engine in just the right spot, or it's easier if you do, to get to each of those. Okay, so you get the idea. We're going to pull the 4 bolts off that hold the fan. So let's do that. Okay, so now we got this fan off, and like I say, the 4 bolts that hold that viscous coupler, they just stay with the fan. So we pull that off. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take the 4 belts off of it, 2 on the alternator, and then there's 1 on the power steering pump and 1 on the air conditioner. But before we do that, these belts hold this bottom pulley tight, and there are 6mm hex bolts that hold this pulley assembly on there. This pulley assembly, and actually it's a harmonic balancer too, and we want to pull that off of there. So the belts will hold this crank. It's just convenient to loosen those up now. Now Gordon won't be able to see with the camera, but if you feel in there, you'll feel those 6mm. They're on the outside of the big 27mm bolt. Now, if this car has been run for a while and the crankshaft seal is bad, chances are there's a lot of dirt and stuff. And they get inside those hex bolts, and you want to be sure to get a good seat. So usually what I do is put it in there and just hammer it, just to make sure that I knock that thing past all that dirt. Now I'm going to loosen all 6 of those. Now we've got a mirror, and we'll just show you where those are. You can see those 6mm. There should be 6 of them, 6mm hex around that 27mm. And we want to loosen those before we take the belts off. Okay. So we're going to loosen those up, take the belts off, and then we'll be ready to pull off that pulley. Okay, so we got those 6mm hex bolts loose, and the next thing is to loosen and take off actually all the belts. First, the alternator. It loosens right there. There is a big bolt on the bottom, if you get under there, that the alternator pivots on. It could be that you have to loosen that. It's kind of unlikely. Usually this will do the trick up on top. It's a 13mm big bolt right there. On the power steering pump, right behind the hoses, there's a 13mm bolt right there, and it's the adjustment. It adjusts the thing, makes it looser. And then there are also some 13mm bolts. It's actually got 3. One of them is right there. One of them is on top right there. And you can't see very well the other one. If you get around front with the camera, Gordon, I'll show you where it is. It's right there, right above the vacuum pump, right there. So it's got an equivalent on the back side. So we need to loosen those 3 to get that thing loose. And then on the air conditioner compressor, the adjustment is a little 10mm nut right there, right on the outside of that hose, that air conditioning hose. It's right there. And then there are 3 19mm bolts. I can point to one of them. I don't know if you can see with the camera, but it's right down in there. There are 3 big bolts that hold this bracket on. You don't have to take them out. You might have to loosen a couple of them up to get that compressor to swing on its attachments. Now we've got the belts off, and the next thing to do is go ahead and take the 6mm hex bolts off. Let me take one off and just show you what it looks like. We got them loose, remember, before we took those belts off. Now, those are the bolts that we're after. There are 6 of them in there. Those are the ones we hammered that in there because of grease and dirt. We want to take all 6 of them off, and then this pulley right here will come right off. So let's do that. Okay. Now before I pull that 6 bolt out, see I've got it loose, I want to get it back exactly the same way it came off of there. You could get it rotated, and so that thing might have a little to do with the balancing on the car. Just in case, I'll just mark it relative to the disc, which I'm going to pull later, and I'll have to mark that relative to the crank. But there's my little white paint mark. It can only be in 6 possibilities, okay, as you rotate it around. So that'll just make sure that I get it back in exactly the same spot. Okay. Now I got the pulley off. The next thing to take off is the harmonic balancer, the balancing disc as it's called in the Mercedes book. Now what you have to do is put some kind of a wedge. There's a gap in this disc, and if you look, I usually just stick a crowbar down in there, and so that'll allow me to back this bolt off, this 27mm big bolt, and it wedges it tight. And this is the place where I use this huge crowbar, or a cheater bar, just so I don't hurt my back. And you can see it's tight. Now once I get it a little bit loose, I can use a standard 1/2-inch drive, but it's tight. Now I got it broken loose, and I'll take it off. Now that disc won't come off until we use that harmonic balance puller on it. So no need to worry for a while. It's still on there. So if you take the bolt off, then we'll attach the puller and pull the disc off. Now we can get this thing 180 degrees out, so we want to be careful to put a mark on this after we get this bolt out. Let's get this bolt all the way out. Make sure you know what we're dealing with here. It's got big washers on it. That's the thing that holds this harmonic balancer on there. And actually it's got a third washer. I think there's only 3 maybe. Okay. Now we want to mark that because it can be 180 degrees out, and we want to mark it relative to the end of that shaft because we can get it on there just backwards. So I'm going to put a mark on this shaft, the same place that my other mark was on for the pulley, with paint. And then we're going to put a puller on it. So the idea, maybe we get a camera and show you where we're going to put that, or I'm sorry, a mirror. Alright, what I want is a mark on the shaft at the place where the mark is. It only has to be close because I just don't want it 180 degrees out. Now is there a mark on the shaft itself? Yes. Okay. And it's close to the mark there. Close enough to where I won't confuse it. Now I'm sure that my harmonic balancer won't be 180 degrees out from... Okay. Now we're ready to use the harmonic balance puller to pull that disc, that balancing disc, harmonic balancer. And this is one of the hex, 6mm hex. And these bolts are going to go in the same hole, so the same thread is one of these 6mm hex bolts that holds that pulley on there. So what we're going to do is put 2 of our bolts that came with the harmonic balance puller in 2 of those holes, and then we're going to pull with this big bolt against the shaft, against the crankshaft, and it's pressed on there, and that's the way that we get it off. Now the way we get it back on, by the way, is we just start it on there in the right spot so that it's not 180 degrees out, and then we use that big 27mm bolt to tighten it back up. So that's the way we press it back on there, but this is the way we get it off. So what we do is at 180 degree intervals, we just put these two on there and tighten them up, of course, where we have enough of a thread to where they don't strip out, and get them even as we can. I just put them finger tight, but at least, you know, 10 or so threads so that we get them screwed down enough, and of course even, so that it's square. And then I want to get this right against that shaft, and you can feel it. And now I've forgotten, I'll have to get the right socket for my harmonic balance puller. I usually put a socket on there. Let me go. It so happens that a 22 millimeter socket fits the hex head on my harmonic balance puller, but yours could be different. Now, that could turn a little bit. We may have to put the crowbar back in there to make sure it doesn't want to turn on us. And you'll feel it start to pull off. Getting close. There it is. Okay. Now you can see I should have a white mark on my shaft. Better. Yeah. Yep. And so now we're close. Now you see this thing is leaking down around here. It's leaking around that shaft. That's the problem. So to get this off, there are 5 millimeter hexes here, and then these, I can't remember whether they're hex or just regular. Yeah, they're just regular. Looks like 10 millimeter. So we take that horseshoe off the top, and then we can get that seal out of there. And then we'll just show you how to replace it. But now we've gotten close to our problem here. Okay, we're almost there. Now we've got a little horseshoe, as I call it. It's around the top of the seal. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4 10 millimeter bolts. And then these are those 5 millimeters. There are 2 that come in from the bottom. So you got to loosen the ones, and it would help if I put my ratchet the other way. Got to loosen those 5 millimeters. Boy, that thing is tight. There. We're going to take those 2 off, and then we're going to take, and that one's in kind of a tight spot. I'm afraid of, I'm going to first use a little hex key instead of that socket because it's in a real tight spot. I can't get a square angle at it, but I'm going to come back and get that in a minute. I'll show you. I need to also take these 4 10 millimeter bolts off, and then we'll pull that horseshoe out of there and be able to get that seal out real easy. So, okay, now this horseshoe affair is about ready to come off. I just usually put a chisel underneath that, and you can see that it just wedges right off of there, both sides, after we take those bolts out. So now you can see that the thing that we want is exposed, and there it is. Okay. Now this is that spacer that I was talking about. And that's the thing, that's the machined part that this thing rides on. So this crankshaft seal rides on that machined part. And normally it's recommended that you take that thing off and replace it so that you get a new, machined part for this to ride on. And that's the thing that can be difficult to get off because of the position of that timing chain and so forth. And sometimes that's real tight, and that one is. So that's our next problem, is to get that off of there and replace it. Now the last thing was to get that ring off of there, and it's usually seized to the shaft. It's the bearing effectively that the seal rides on. And propane torch will work. It's a little slower than acetylene, but most people don't have an acetylene torch at home. If you do, that's fine. Heat it up. It helps if you have two people for this job. It just takes a few minutes, but it's kind of important. What you do is you heat that ring up, and you what Gordon and I did is put a big pair of pliers on there. And while I was heating it, he put the pliers on the ring, and just as the ring expands, because it has so much less mass than the crankshaft, it expands out, and then you'll feel it break loose, and you just pull it off of there. And you can see that it comes off. Now, of course, the reason to need it is because you see it wears out. It even has a groove in it where the seal wore down on it. So that's where the seal occurs, and you got to change this as you change the crankshaft seal. Now the new ring that we have will go right on there, should go on there real easy. Now we're ready to start putting it back together. We got to clean this surface up a little bit, and we'll show you some of the initial stages of putting it back together. So let's do that. Now one way of putting this crank seal back is to use a special tool that Mercedes has, and we don't have that tool. The problem is that the seal, the rubber part of the seal, goes right around this ring that needs to go on there. So what we've done is mount the seal with sealing compound. I like to use a silicone sealing compound. It comes from Mercedes. So we put the 4 bolts in the top and the two hexes in the bottom. And now what we're going to do, one method, is to take this thing and drive it on around the seal. It slips right over the seal. But what we need to do is just get some oil and lubricate it so it slides real easy. So we just need to make sure that we've got the thing good and slippery. And we want it to slide right over that seal. And I always just put a little oil in both places. Not going to hurt a thing. It's just motor oil. And then what I use is an 1.5 inch piece of PVC, 1.5 inch piece of PVC, and we need to get it started first, of course. But then once we get it started, an 1.5 inch PVC slips over the shaft, and you see it just slips right in there. And the seal goes, the ring goes in all the way against that timing chain gear, and that's perfectly fitted around that seal, and I know that the rim is just right. Now what I did was take off 2 of the washers on this big crank bolt, because I can't get that thing on there far enough to get the bolt started unless I take a couple of washers off. So I take the washers off, get the bolt started, drive this balancer on there as best I can. I kept the pins on the balancer because they were real tight in there. Line it up the best I can to get it started, then use a mirror to make sure they're lined up. And so we can see we've got those pins pretty well lined up with that crank. And so now we're going to, we took the bolt back out in order to see where we were lined up. Now we're going to just take and put all the washers on there and drive that thing on and torque it down. And of course we're going to have to put our crowbar back in there to make sure the engine doesn't turn. So if I could get it started, still can't get it started, I'm going to have to is 2. And now I gotta back it off enough to get my wedge in there. And then use the bolt to crank the thing down. Now we torqued that thing down. We had those pins all lined up and we torqued it down. And you really have to put some torque on it. With a 3/4, you even have to use a cheater bar to get it pretty tight. It's supposed to be like 250 foot-pounds of torque. I wouldn't worry about turning that bolt and breaking it. I don't think you can strip that bolt out, but I don't have a 3/4 inch drive torque wrench, so I just put it tight with a cheater bar and a pipe like that. That's plenty tight. And so now that we have that, I think you can get most of the rest of it back together. I can't imagine that you would have any more problems. It just goes back together the way it came apart. We've got to put the fan pulley back on there. Remember those 6 hex bolts I mean? So as soon as we put the fan pulley back on, then we need to put the fan blade back on and reattach the belts, and then put the radiator back in and the air cleaner back on, and we're good to go. And attach, of course, that oil cooler. So we'll button this one up.